Well, welcome again to Psychology to Live By. And today's another Q&A, this time with some very mindful friends, as we'll see. Our topic is quietening the mind, and the participants have watched two podcasts of that name, and you can see those or listen to them at my website, drchris.life. And I'll do a quick summary now of part two of that podcast before we go into our Q&A. So in part one, we examined the reasons that a quiet mind is so beneficial. And we looked at two practices to induce it, extended out-breathing and a simple mindfulness meditation. In this part, we'll explore other applications: everyday mindfulness, interpersonal mindfulness, and using mindfulness to increase our emotional intelligence and thereby our emotional balance. Now, it's absolutely normal in mindfulness practices for our attention to wander. And of course, it also does this generally in life while we're undertaking everyday tasks somewhat mindlessly. So if you think of showering, brushing teeth, eating meals, dressing yourself, walking, how much do you pay attention to the actual activity? So one way of building your mindfulness capability is to turn these everyday activities into mindfulness practices. So you just choose one, let's say it's showering, and you just practice noticing every feature of that, every sensation, every sound, and every sight. You might do this daily for about 3 weeks, and you'll notice the calmness and the serenity that result. And then you switch to another task and do the same. These activities won't take any longer, and perhaps you'll also notice you do the task much better. Another very frequent everyday activity in which our attention drifts is when we're listening while other people are speaking. We frequently are allegedly listening as we get lost in our own thoughts or in our own desire to speak. This is another opportunity to practice what I call interpersonal mindfulness. And here, the object of attention is not the breathing, for example, but it's another human being. And you do it by just being intentionally 100% present and listening with your whole being. And I think it helps to become genuinely interested and curious in understanding the other person. So you push away your thoughts, all your brilliant ideas, and your desire to respond in favour of this very curious listening. And of course you can speak, but you're limiting that in favour of this listening. And you'll notice many improvements that result interpersonally. Your insights into people, your own sense of calmness, maybe your affection for other people, improvements in relationships. You might notice people relaxing more and more around you, and so on. And finally, we can use mindfulness techniques in service of our own emotional balance. And an interesting feature of the way we're actually designed to perceive and respond to the world is that when sensory information comes into our brain, it goes to the emotional centers first and then subsequently to the broader cortex, especially the prefrontal cortex. Now, the implication of this is that we only get to think about that which has already been filtered emotionally. And this emotional appraisal, we call it a quick and dirty appraisal. If it happens to be strongly negatively emotional, we may not get very much conscious reasoning, but just spring straight into defensive or aggressive action, i.e. fight-flight. But it turns out that we have 200 milliseconds window in which we can veto this initial appraisal and stop it cascading and leading to extended experience of negative emotions and then actions that stem from them. So this ability to veto that quick and dirty emotional appraisal in 1/5 of a second can actually increase our emotional balance and wisdom in action. In my view, it constitutes our relative human freedom. And of course, thereby, it's a really wonderful capacity to develop. All right, that's enough of that. And it will take us now to our Q&A. And as promised, our very mindful participants, uh, as usual, I'm very interested in your thoughts and your questions, your insights. And who would like to start here? Maybe, I don't know, Colleen. Would, are you happy enough? Have I put you in the deep end?
No, you have. I was really interested in the what is it, 200 milliseconds?
Yes. Yes,
Um,
it seems like a very short time, but it's actually longer than you think. But go on, yeah.
because you can see when that happens. You
Yeah.
know when you're able to switch it off, or you're able to be present, or when you're drifting off, or when it's just too late, when you're when you're
Yes.
gone.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And trying to kind of bring it back in.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes. Look, a couple of things there. That's really great insight because one of the things you're trying to do, for example, in general mindfulness practices, whether it's formal meditation or everyday mindfulness, is you're building your capacity to notice things at a more subtle level, and even to note the beginning of an emotion rather than only noticing it when it's already so embodied that it's distorting our capacity to think. So it's um, by practicing this, we actually get better and better at picking up the genesis, the very beginning of our experience, and at that point, we've got a much higher chance of shifting attention or changing the way we're thinking. Right? Um, Interestingly, little kids don't have this capacity, or they have it in a very attenuated way. And the ability for us to then moderate ourselves actually develops well into the 20s, or not. So, and and I think there are two reasons for the or not. One would be um, that person really has had very little modeling of how to do this and encouragement to do it. And the other is that they just haven't practiced the kinds of mindfulness things that we're talking about, right? Or haven't been made aware of it. So, like, even knowing this is very helpful.
and when you
You know,
recognize it in other people that you're talking to as well, you
yes,
can see them kind of switch
yeah,
off.
yeah, and you literally can see it, right? And when people get carried away with deeply negative emotion, their capacity to actually take in information, to actually listen to what you're saying, or even their logicality, really, is greatly, reduced. And so that can also mean that, from our point of view, we can be a little bit less reactive, a little bit more compassionate and understanding, because we understand this is the way we're all wired. Yeah, that's terrific. I'm glad we started with you, Colin. Now you guys are going to have to live up to that very high standard. Who would like to go next?
Well, I'll go next.
Yeah,
I think the one thing about that pause, that 1/5 of a second pause,
yeah,
is it seems longer because you get to revisit it constantly.
great. Yeah,
And I would almost say that it's almost like you can split your conscience, so you can watch yourself
yeah,
and you decide if you want to change the path that you're going down, or whether you want to go down the same rabbit hole you've always gone down,
yeah,
or whether you want to use that observation of yourself to change the pathway and maybe change the conversation.
yeah, yeah,
And I find that incredibly helpful in dealing with my little girls,
yeah.
because they think
So,
daddy works in one way. When daddy works a different way, it completely throws them off, and I get their attention.
yeah, and a couple of things there, Terry. Um, I mean, this is very deep waters now when we're talking about this capacity, in a sense, for a part of us, or an awareness to separate off from our actual experiencing. So it's a kind of, in psychobabble, we might call it metacognition, thinking about thinking, or in the more, say, Buddhist traditions, it's distinguishing out this sort of little me from a much larger sense of awareness, and dropping back into that larger sense of awareness, and then being able to observe the automatic playing out of our mind. As soon as you do that, you're not the mind. You're not that little mind, that reactive system. You're something larger and greater, ironically, of course, also nothing and empty, but we won't go into that. But it gives you now a choice, and you can shift attention to I think in another podcast I talked once about what I call the two conditions test, where we question our thinking as to whether it's realistic and whether it's helpful. And often our thinking is realistic enough, but it's actually not very wise. But we can't apply that two conditions test if we're highly reactive, if we haven't practiced and understood the value, as you have, of that 200 milliseconds, that ability to separate and de-identify or defuse our identity from these automatic reactions. And look, in kids, you mentioned your kids. There's nothing in the universe more designed to trigger our kind of pre-programmed reactions than kids. They give us a thorough examination over years.
There's three other parents going like this.
Yeah. They reach into every nook and cranny of our unexamined consciousness. They're overall a very humbling experience in my experience. Fantastic. Who else?
So something that really resonated with me when you talked about being present, like being in the shower and just being present to what's happening in the moment. This is something that I've been working on and trying to become more of an active listener or a generous listener, getting away from the news ticker in the brain while I'm having a conversation with somebody.
Yeah.
I just find that how that relates, when you're able to do that, become present to the person in front of you and what's happening, how the connection deepens. And in the workplace, how that relates to collaboration, that connection, and being able to have a deeper collaboration with people. So I was wondering if maybe you could speak to a little bit more on that.
That's fantastic. That's so good. Yeah, so I have this phrase I use, interpersonal mindfulness, and it's interesting, because most people's experience of mindfulness practices will be, say, mindfulness of the breath, for example. That's the most frequent thing, and it's actually very hard, because once you quieten down, it's a very subtle thing to be noticing, and there's much more attractive things in the mind that will take us away, right? But if you think about it, mindfulness of other people, that's potentially a much more engaging object of attention, right? If we remember, and a lot of these everyday mindfulness things are actually about remembering to do it, right? But if we remember that in front of me is this extraordinary creature, it's this other human being, and in some ways they're just like me, in other ways they're just incredibly different to me. I don't know what their experience is. I might think I do, but there's so much there that one can discover in another person, right? Now imagine that if we take that orientation to everyone we meet. Imagine what it's like for you as someone sitting opposite you, and you get the sense they just think you're so interesting, and they're just desperate to understand you, and they really, and there's this really positive sense in which they may not agree with everything you're saying, but they really value you, or that they affirm your very existence. That's just got to be a way of opening up their mind, of opening up the relationship, of opening up the conversation. And I know you work in the HR space, and you would know that this concept of psychological safety is very, very big in organisations these days, quite rightly. And this would be at every individual's level away. It doesn't matter what level they are in an organisation. This would be, in my view, how you are literally walking around all day long creating psychological safety.
Completely, yeah. And that connection in having somebody feel seen, heard, and respected, and that's where that psychological safety comes from.
Exactly. And it's much more about listening than speaking.
Yeah.
And speaking is important. It's not that, but it's we become so much more effective when we listen deeply. When we get a feel for exactly where a person is, who they are, spontaneously we respond in ways that are appropriate. And by analogy, I think of it. It's a terrible analogy, so please forgive it. But imagine if you were playing tennis with your eyes closed. So you've got no idea really where the ball is. So probably the best shot would be to play either a forehand or a backhand, whatever you're best at. So if you're best at backhands, you just keep playing backhands because you don't know where the ball is. Now, I would allege that a lot of people are playing tennis with their eyes closed in the way that they interact with other people. They're not listening. They don't see the ball coming over the net, so they just play their repertoire, regardless of where the ball is. And I think that people say, would like to, been asked to consult, and can you teach us some communication skills, and how can I better persuade and influence, et cetera, et cetera. And they're all good things. There are things that can be done. But the heavy lifting, I don't think people need to be trained in what to say next, in the sense that if they're really listening and they really get where a person's at, what's going to come out of their mouth is going to be germane. It's going to be appropriate. It's going to fit the niche. Do you know what I mean? So before we get to fancy techniques, I suggest we go back to basics and just listen. Yeah. Fantastic.
That's great.
So I don't have a question, but I have a couple of related, perhaps, observations.
Yeah, a few. Your questions are so scary, but yeah.
So a lot of this is sort of relating to, something I've been thinking about, which is like the way that the impacts that we as individuals have on the world. And it seems like, and I had a thought when we were talking about the 200 milliseconds part, which is an opportunity for you to, your brain is presenting you with an option. Here's an event that's happened. Here's the path. I'm going to give you a fraction of a second to steer away from that. Otherwise, we're going down this sort of route. And that knee-jerk route is probably not one that is productive for yourself, but also productive for the people around you. To Terry's conversation also about kids, being able to circumvent that and take another path is probably the one that will lead to the best outcomes for the people around you, and have your impact be the most positive. And the same with that mindful listening, where it is an opportunity for you not only to have a more engaging experience yourself, but also create a better exchange for the person speaking, right? Because we've all been in those situations where we're talking and you can tell the other person is just like, you know what I mean? And you're sort of like,
yeah,
what am I doing here? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do.
And so by being present and thinking through, and I recently had an exchange with somebody who's at the other end of the spectrum, who was the most focused listener that I've ever encountered. And it was amazing because she's, you talk for a while and then she's like, okay, cool. You talked about these 4 things. Let's unpack all of them. And you're like, how did you keep track of this? I want to learn this superpower. How do you do this?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think that superpower is exactly what we've been talking about today. First off, it starts with intention. As I said, you've got to remember,
Mm-hmm.
like you have that superpower already. It's just, but we form habits of not listening. But those habits are also informed by our own anxiety or our stress or our need to, so what you see in often what passes as a conversation is two people who are impatient to say what they want to say. And
They're not listening, they're waiting to talk.
yeah, or what they call reloading, and so, but I'm interested in that in an aspect of what you said as well about, it can feel a little insulting if we're in the presence of someone and they're clearly not listening. They're talking to us while they're doing a text message, or their responses are indicating they're sort of non sequiturs. They're not really engaged. So it's interesting that when we practice this, as you say, I think it's quite right. We actually create. We're speaking to, if I can put it in more poetic language, we're speaking to the better angels of people's nature. And here's a way of thinking about that all of us have potential for good and for evil. We all, are imperfect. And we have like a repertoire of ways we could be in the world. And with certain people, they bring out the best in us. And certain people bring out the worst. And but we have that superpower with respect to other people. We can increase the odds that their better angels are going to be manifest, right? And talking earlier to Karen about psychological safety, the research is clear that on average, if people feel heard and understood and respected, and then we're going to get more of the better side of their nature coming forward. Yeah, and this has enormous implications, of course, because for even globally, certainly nationally, in terms of, for example, civics, like just civic awareness. If we appeal to the meaner dimensions of people's personalities and consciousness, then that's what we'll get. And we've got it. So we have to have this sort of courage to unilaterally be kind, compassionate, generous, and we're much more likely, in most occasions, not with everyone, in most occasions, to bring forth far better, more civic, more positive, more healthy ways of being. Yeah. Fantastic. Even when you don't ask a question, your observations are curly. So now I think we've spoken to everyone. Is that right? That's my sense of it. Well, thank you so much. You didn't disappoint. You really stretched me in my thinking, and I thank you for that. And I look forward to our next engagement, our next Q&A. I'm not sure what that topic will be, but I'm sure it'll be fun. Okay, guys. See you all.